Following our somewhat distressing conversation regarding Arcasa's future, Salcom was fortunately kind enough to allow me and my posse access to Gold Nest's guest rooms for the night. Stepping inside the opulently decorated living space and allowing Chot to close the door behind me following a curt goodbye, I slowly made my over to the nearby bed fashioned from some unimaginably soft green fabric, and plopping myself down onto it, retrieved the accompanying television's nearby remote. Wearily sifting through Zintral's myriad media, I continued all the while to contemplate the Prime Minister's newfound vision, that of an Arcasa unified beneath his nation's banner. Logically, it made sense to unify the planet whilst our technological advantage was still in play. I will admit some part of me found this idea to be tempting, the concept of uniting an entire planet beneath the ideals of democracy and equality. Perhaps with my help they could build a utopia, but would it be worth the living cost? With the sheer technological advantage I could provide, such an idea was not only possible but entirely feasible. What sort of resistance could the other war-bruised nations possibly mount against a warfare capacity centuries beyond their current capabilities? There would be no war of unification. A few nuclear warheads detonated in unpopulated regions would be all it'd take to cow any resistance into submission. More importantly, the government I could help assemble wouldn't be like the UN, weak, inefficient, and corrupt beyond purpose. Perhaps something more akin to the states of my home country would be serviceable. Nations could retain some degree of independence whilst still kowtowing to the greater whole. Casting aside for the moment that somewhat concerning line of thought and entangling myself with a sigh into the blankets of my resting place, I gently resigned myself to surfing the channels, eventually settling once again upon the nightly news. Tonight, a press statement from Gold Nest's executive branch. A few hours ago, prior to his meeting with a mysterious guest, Prime Minister Salcom released the following statement to our correspondent. Following this promise of word from their leader, the news channel's audio changed to a recording of Salcom's voice evidently received from this correspondent of whom they spoke. People of Zintral, I know you're hurting. This nation has spent the past few decades beaten, battered, and broken. But that all changes soon. This war will end. Our people will rise. Mark my words and set your alarms for the third segment. For tomorrow morning there will be news from the front lines, and it will be good news. You heard it here first, people. The anchor tuned in, their tones simmering with false optimism in regards to the words of Salcom. Clearly this wasn't the first time they've heard such promises. This time, however, they were anything but empty. Fortunately for me, there would be no need to set an alarm, as there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell that I wouldn't be woken up for the war report. Following the recording of Salcom's rousing speech, the news channel quickly adopted a much more conspiratorial tone, as various Kafel were invited to theorize upon the nature of Salcom's mysterious guest. The head anchor's initial theory pitted me as a Providence turncoat, dissatisfied with the regime, and willing to surrender their secrets in exchange for my own skin. This theory, however, was quickly discarded by the other speakers, including their special guest, the nation's former military commander, who posited in turn that I was a brilliant scientist working on theoretical technologies. I'm flattered. By the end of the segment, as the group was taking callers to discuss their own theories, I decided myself to be done with real-world events for the day. Leafing once more through the small handful of channels, my attention soon fell upon a title screen bearing a name I recognized from my prior conversation with Kirak, Voidstar. This was for me a most welcome surprise, as I longed to obtain a better understanding of Kafel media. Even besides that, however, I quickly found myself engulfed in the ensuing story of unity and the power of all Kafel united against a single foe. Somewhere in optimism between War of the Worlds and Independence Day, the film saw most of the Kafel governments collapsing rather quickly at the hands of their invaders, leaving behind only a plucky guerrilla resistance unified together from every nation. Unified. Once again, my thoughts returned to the Prime Minister's plan. Knowing what I do now about extraterrestrial intelligence, who's to say that conquering aliens like the fictional black hole orbiting Wakia weren't the norm in this galaxy? Knowing our divided nature, the odds of humankind surviving an encounter with hostile aliens weren't precisely optimistic. A unified Kafel empire could serve as a powerful ally to my own people. Nevertheless, I couldn't bring myself to entirely agree with the notion, nor to entirely discard it. No need to decide it right now, I murmured to myself, nestling further into the warm oblivion of impending sleep as on-screen the title card for Dark Star 2 flashed against the backdrop of a starry night sky. All in all, the sequel wasn't half bad. I especially appreciated the twist at the end where the Wekia were revealed to be wanderers desperate to find a new home before their own is forced from the habitable zone and sucked into its black hole star. Morally questionable villains are fun for me. All this being said, eventually there came a point whereupon I could no longer keep my eyes open. Where exactly I fell asleep is hard to tell, as the movies bled rather seamlessly into my dreams. The first point I can recall, which was definitely not part of the movie, was where I was stood in a courtroom with a bunch of Wekia, most of whom were calling me a traitor for some reason. The dream ended with my execution, as I shortly thereafter awoke to an empty guest room. Craning my neck to peer upon the wall-mounted clock, I was surprised to find myself only halfway through the day's first segment. "That was a vivid dream," I exclaimed with a whisper, amused by how real it had first seemed, despite the situation's now clear absurdity. Perhaps another man might have found some secret purpose within the nocturnal hallucination, but I was not the sort to place my stock in dreams. The majority of my morning was spent upon exercising. My few remaining gene mods were meant to prevent muscle atrophy following long periods in low G, but I held little intention of leaving such an important factor entirely out of my control. Physical toll aside, it was pretty fun to be able to do one-handed push-ups. Following the brief bath and breakfast which followed, I decided it best not to wait for my translator's arrival. And so, stepping out into the hall, I briskly began making my way toward Salkim's office. Curiously enough, my arrival was met with no secretary's greeting, as the one formerly standing watch over Salkim's office was nowhere to be seen. Fearing the worst, I crept closer to the door and carefully placed my ear against it, listening for any signs of trouble. Were there more Providence operatives we didn't catch? Or what if this is a coup? By this point, I assumed that nothing I could hear would possibly surprise me. I was wrong. "So you're saying it's possible?" Salkim's voice clickered expectantly, evidently speaking with someone over the phone, as I did not hear a reply before he then continued. "I'm saying you've got alien genetic engineering tech and 500 samples. Can you make that work? Yes? Good. 500 samples. It was only at this point I remembered the little capsule sent along with me on this journey and every other space foray since 2100. The one containing DNA from hundreds of humans. It was initially meant as an emergency measure in case a new human population needed to be established. That being said, I got the strange feeling that Salkim's plan for them was a bit more ambitious than that alone.